In the history of college football, every program to ever put a team together has had some sort of success in one way or another. Although every team's goal is to win every game they play in, we know that some wins are much bigger and mean more than others. At the beginning of every college football season, every team in the country starts to work towards one goal: win enough games to earn a spot in the college football playoff, and beyond that, win the national championship. Of course, we know that this isn't possible for all teams, specifically the smaller programs, but the teams that know they have a shot do everything in their power to earn a coveted spot in the playoff. How those teams do in the regular season, among other things, determines whether or not they are granted a spot in the playoff. But no matter how well any of those teams do they get in, it doesn't really matter to them if they just lose the first game. One team that has always had success in the regular season but has never been able to complete the playoff journey, capped off with the national championship, are the Oklahoma Sooners. In the 7 years of the college football playoff, Oklahoma has made it in 4 times but have lost every single game. Besides this past season, they have consistently been a double-digit win team, but have yet to even put together a respectable playoff fight. Today we'll be looking at the college football playoff journey of the Oklahoma Sooners and discuss the factors that played into the 4 losses that they suffered. So let's get into it. We'll start with the 2015 Sooners, and this team was coached by Bob Stoops. The identity of this team was its stellar offense, led by Baker Mayfield, Samaje Perine, and Sterling Shepard. Baker had just transferred from Texas Tech and was about to play in his first season at Oklahoma, so he came into the season with a chip on his shoulder, considering he was a walk-on at Texas Tech and had now transferred. Another transfer on the team was D.D. Westbrook, who was a JUCO transfer from the same school as Cam Newton, Blinn College. He was a 4-star recruit coming out of there and was picked up by the Sooners. The team came into the season with a new offensive coordinator, Lincoln Riley. He had come from East Carolina, whom he led to the 3rd best passing offense and the 5th best overall offense in the country the year before. He ran the air raid offense, and many people were curious to see how his offense would fit into Oklahoma, especially with all of the playmakers on this team. On the defensive side, the Sooners were coached by Mike Stoops. They were returning 9 starters and had high expectations going into this season. Overall, the team was looking to bounce back from the previous year, in which they went 8-5 and lost to Clemson in the Russell Athletic Bowl by more than 30 points. They came into the 2015 season as the 19th best team in the country, and through the first 4 games of the season, everything was going right for the Sooners. They beat Akron in their opening game by 38 points, Tennessee by a touchdown, Tulsa by 2 touchdowns, and West Virginia by 20 points. But it was in week 4 when they played their rival Texas in the Red River rivalry. Coming into that game, Oklahoma was ranked number 10 in the country and was averaging 42 points per game. Not only that, but the Texas team they were playing was just 1-4 going into this game, so it should have been a walk in the park for Oklahoma. But anyone who's a fan of college football knows that when there's a rivalry game, no matter what the records are of the teams playing is, anything can happen. From the start of the game, it was clear that Texas came to play and Oklahoma didn't. Texas jumped out to a 14-0 lead in the first quarter, and the great offense that I kept talking about earlier only mustered a field goal before halftime. In the second half, they kind of got back on track, but it was too late. The final score was 24-17, and just like that, Oklahoma had suffered their first loss of the year and took a big hit in the AP polls. I don't think this was what anyone expected, and even though it would hurt Oklahoma, it did not put them out of the playoff picture. They fell to number 19 in the polls, which wasn't horrible and was definitely something they could bounce back from. Instead of sitting down and giving up after that loss, they used it as motivation and the next week crushed Kansas State 55-0. They continued going on a tear throughout the rest of the season and almost slipped up against an 11th ranked TCU, only winning by 1 point, but they pulled it out. They capped their regular season off with a 58-23 win in the Bedlam game against Oklahoma State. Some standout performances on the year were Baker Mayfield, who finished with 3,700 passing yards and 37 touchdowns. He also finished 4th in the Heisman voting that year. Samaje Perine, who had just under 1,400 rushing yards and 16 touchdowns, and is overall one of the most underrated players, I think. There was also Sterling Shepard, who led the receivers with 1,288 receiving yards and 11 touchdowns. On the other side of the ball, Dominique Alexander led the team in tackles with 104 and also had an interception. The team as a whole ended the season really well and didn't let their early season loss against Texas affect the rest of their season. Due to their performance in that season, the Sooners earned the 4th spot in the college football playoff. They were set to play the Clemson Tigers on December 31st, 2015, and even though the Tigers were slightly favored, the Sooners believed that they could win. Clemson was stacked with guys like Deshaun Watson, Wayne Gallman, and Mackenzie Alexander. But the main question going into that game for the Sooners was if their offensive line would be able to take on Clemson's defensive line. Clemson's D-line was anchored by Shaq Lawson, and many thought that the young O-line of the Sooners would not be able to slow them down. As the game began, it looked like it would come down to the last quarter since the two teams went back and forth, and by halftime, Oklahoma had a 1-point lead. But after halftime, it was all downhill for the Sooners. They were held scoreless for the rest of the game and really didn't have a chance once the second half began. The final score was 17-37 Clemson. When you look at the game in whole, there's really no one thing you can point to and say that's what lost the game. Baker Mayfield threw for over 300 yards and a touchdown. Samaje Perine had 58 rushing yards and a touchdown, which isn't a great performance, but he contributed a score. Wayne Gallman was the game changer for the Tigers as he had 150 rushing yards and 2 touchdowns. In all, the Sooners were in simplest terms just outperformed by a better team. The Tigers were favored going into the game and proved they were worthy of that. The Sooners gave it their best effort and played a good game up until the latter part of it. But despite this win, it was an overall good year for Oklahoma, and there was no reason that they wouldn't be able to compete for a championship in the upcoming seasons. Now moving to 2017, the Sooners had high hopes for this year. They were coming off another 11-2 season in which they ranked 5th in the final AP poll, just missing the playoffs, but still a good year nonetheless. D.D. Westbrook actually won the Biletnikoff Award in that 2016 season, and Baker Mayfield came in 3rd in the Heisman voting, so the future was bright. And this was the year that it would all come together. They had a senior Baker Mayfield who had done great things the past 2 seasons. They had a running back duo of Rodney Anderson and Trey Sermon, and a wideout by the name of Marquise Brown. On the other side of the ball, guys like Emmanuel Beal and Kenneth Murray would be anchoring the Sooner defense. But the biggest change that would be happening this season was that Lincoln Riley would be the head coach for the first time. Bob Stoops had decided his last season would be in 2016, which left the offensive coordinator to step into that role. They started out the season ranked 7th and got all the way up to number 2 by the 3rd game, but just like that 2015 season, that 4th game is when their record took a hit. They had done good up until that point, including a win over 2nd-ranked Ohio State. Their 4th game was against Iowa State, and they came into that game ranked 3rd in the country. Going into this game, the Cyclones had not beaten Oklahoma since 1990, and it didn't seem like this was the year that that streak would end. Iowa State was 2-2 and wasn't even ranked. The game started well, and at halftime the Sooners had a 24-13 lead. But the second half was much different. The Cyclones offense exploded for 25 points in the second half and held the Sooners to just 1 score in that time. The final score ended up being 38-31 as Iowa State capped off an insane upset. That loss would put a dent in Oklahoma's year, and they went from being ranked number 3 to number 12, which was a big drop, but it was possible to come back from. Just like in the 2015 season, they did lose their 5th game, but didn't let it affect the rest of their season. After that game, they went on an 8-game win streak and did not lose another game for the rest of the regular season. They went from number 12 all the way back up to number 2, and by the time the playoffs came around, they were set to play the number 3 team, the Georgia Bulldogs. So in 2015, which was the last time they played in the playoffs, they were the number 4 team going up against the number 1 team, which meant that the game was supposed to be a little lopsided. But now they were the number 2 team going against the number 3 team, so this game was supposed to be very even, and it was. It was one of the best games in the history of the college football playoff. Oklahoma once again started off the game very well as they jumped out to a 31-17 lead at halftime. The Bulldogs came out in the second half and scored 14 unanswered points, but it became a battle, and by the end of regulation, it was 45-45. But as y'all probably already know, the Sooners just could not finish the job. Sony Michel carried the ball into the end zone on a 27-yard run and ended the Sooners season in heartbreaking fashion. In my opinion, the best performance from the game for Oklahoma was Rodney Anderson's 201 rushing yards and 2 touchdowns. The game was hard fought, and both teams deserved recognition for their efforts as they both had over 500 yards of total offense. So when we look at this game in whole, both teams gave forth their best effort in order to win, and neither team had a bad game. Yes, Oklahoma jumped out to an early lead and had a chance to put the game away, but they didn't. They had to have known that Georgia wasn't just going to hand the game over since the stakes were so high. In the end, it came down to a few possessions, and the game could have easily gone Oklahoma's way. The season was ultimately a success, even though things didn't end as planned. Baker Mayfield won the Heisman Trophy, and they still had a bunch of promising young players like Kyler Murray and CeeDee Lamb. With a promising young core of players and the great year that they had just had, the Sooners were confident that 2018 was their year. Now, 2018 was a very, very good year for Oklahoma. First off, they had so many all-around athletes that their offense was almost impossible to defend. They were going to be without their Heisman quarterback, Baker Mayfield, for the first time in 3 years, but the guy who would be replacing him was arguably better than him, but definitely more versatile. That guy was Kyler Murray, and like Baker Mayfield, he was also a transfer, but he was from Texas A&M. Other guys that would be key contributors on the offensive side were Trey Sermon, Kennedy Brooks, Marquise Brown, and CeeDee Lamb. So we know that the offense had immense potential. However, the main concern for Lincoln Riley was his defense. The 2017 season that they were coming off of, the defense gave up 27 points per game. They had lost guys like Emmanuel Beal, who was their leading tackler that season, and Ogbonnia Okoronkwo, who was the former co-Big 12 Defensive Player of the Year. But they were returning their top defensive back, Parnell Motley, and star linebacker Kenneth Murray, who had both shown a lot of potential. Despite the loss of really good players, the Sooners still had a lot of great players still on their roster and were predicted to go around 10-2 or 11-1, which ended up being pretty accurate. They started out the season as the 7th ranked team in the country, and just like they always had, they coasted through the first couple games of the season. However, as most of y'all may have picked up by now, they just couldn't have an undefeated regular season. They ended up losing their first game of the year to Texas, and if y'all remember, they also lost their first game of the season to Texas in the 2015 season, but unlike then, they lost to a much better Texas team this year, so it wasn't as bad of a loss. The Texas team they played this year was ranked 19th in the country, and they only lost by 3 points. The game was a shootout as both teams combined for almost 100 points. The loss wasn't by a lot of points, and it was against a pretty good team, so they only moved down 2 spots in the rankings. By the next week, they were back to their normal selves, scoring 50 points a game and crushing opponents. They went the rest of the regular season without losing another game, even though they almost had a couple of slip-ups since they only beat Oklahoma State by 1 and a 12th ranked West Virginia by 3. However, they capped off the regular season by getting revenge on the team that had ruined their regular season, Texas, as they beat them 39-27 in the Big 12 championship. With that win, Oklahoma moved up from number 5 to number 4 in the rankings and once again made it into the college football playoff. This time they were set to play an undefeated and number 1 ranked Alabama team in the Capital One Orange Bowl. Now, like the 2015 season, going into this game, they were obviously underdogs since they were the 4th seed. Alabama were heavy favorites going into the game, and they showed us why. The game started out horribly for the Sooners because they were shut out in the first quarter 21-0. By halftime, they managed to score and get a field goal, but that didn't do much, and the score going into halftime was 31-10. The Sooners gave a valiant effort to come back in the second half, but to no avail. They did score 10 unanswered points in the second half, making it 31-20, but that's the closest that they got to Alabama, and the final score ended up being 45-34. When we look at the game in whole, it really was over before it started. The game went exactly as it was expected to go. Alabama, who was ranked higher and expected to win, did just that with little to no problems. But some notable performances for Oklahoma were Kyler Murray, who had over 300 passing yards and over 100 rushing yards with 3 touchdowns. CeeDee Lamb, who had over 100 receiving yards and a touchdown. Now, when we look at the entire year as a whole, it was not a bad season for Oklahoma at all. Kyler Murray, who had over 4,000 passing yards and 1,000 rushing yards, won the Heisman Trophy, which now meant Oklahoma had back-to-back Heisman Trophy winners. There was also Kennedy Brooks and Trey Sermon in the backfield, who both almost had 1,000 rushing yards with Trey Sermon coming up just short. Out wide, Marquise Brown and CeeDee Lamb both had over 1,000 receiving yards and double-digit touchdowns. The leading tackler on the team and the guy who led this defense the entire year was Kenneth Murray with 155 tackles. Basically, from a statistical standpoint, the Sooners had a great season. However, from a success standpoint, they just couldn't get the job done. 2019. So we have arrived to the last year that Oklahoma has made the playoffs as of the date of this video. So in 2019, we saw a couple of changes in Oklahoma, with the most notable being the transfer of Jalen Hurts from Alabama. He would be the starter that year and had an amazing season, which we will go over in a little bit. Some other notable players who were returning were Kennedy Brooks, who is coming off a 1,000-yard rushing season, and Trey Sermon, who had 947 rushing yards the year before. So if the passing game wasn't going to work for the Sooners, they knew they could just fall back on the running game. They also had CeeDee Lamb returning, who would easily be their best receiver on the year. On the other side of the ball, Kenneth Murray, who would be coming back for his junior season, which was huge since he was the team's leading tackler the season before. Alright, so now we'll jump into the season and see how they did. They started off the season ranked 4th in the country, and like they usually did, they coasted through the first few games of the season once again. They crushed opponents and even beat an 11th ranked Texas 34-27. But as the season progressed, it became inevitable that they would eventually slip up, and they did. In the 8th game of the season, they traveled to the city of Manhattan to take on the Kansas State Wildcats. Before the game began, the Sooners had an 89% chance to win, so they were heavily favored. Kansas State was 4-2 going into this game and wasn't even ranked. In fact, if someone were to go down the list of teams that Oklahoma played that year and picked just one team to beat Oklahoma, the last team they probably would have picked would have been this Kansas State team. In short, they lost the game, and it was a huge upset. The score was 48-41, so at least it was close, but the loss was not a good one since Kansas State wasn't even ranked, and the Sooners only moved down 4 spots in the rankings. The next week, they almost lost again. They had another away game at Iowa State, and I don't know if they were still down about the week before, but they didn't play well. Nonetheless, they won, but only by 1 point, as the final score was 42-41. They ended up going the rest of the regular season without losing another game, even though they had a couple of close calls. So they earned a trip to the Big 12 championship game and were set to play Baylor. Going into the game, Oklahoma was ranked number 6 and Baylor was ranked number 8, so the game was supposed to be a good one, and it was. Oklahoma was favored, but both teams came to play. In the first quarter, the Sooners held Baylor scoreless and went up 10-0. In the second quarter, Baylor scored 13 unanswered points and had a lead going into halftime. Eventually, the game went into overtime, but Oklahoma managed to pull it out 30-23. With that win, they earned a spot in the college football playoff for the 4th time in 6 years. Once again, they were the 4th seed and were set to play an undefeated LSU team who had a Heisman winner behind center. This team would easily be the best team they would play in the college football playoff, and we would see why. The game was never really close, and Oklahoma didn't seem like a threat throughout the entire game. By halftime, the score was 49-14, and the game was all but over. The final score would end up being 63-28, with some notable performances being Joe Burrow, who had 493 passing yards and 7 touchdowns. Justin Jefferson had 14 receptions for 227 yards and 4 touchdowns. For Oklahoma, they just could never get anything going and didn't really have a chance against this team. I don't really blame them though. The 2019 LSU team is arguably the greatest team of all time, and Joe Burrow might have had the greatest season ever as a college quarterback. So, no one could really match up with these guys. As most of us know, that LSU team went on to win the national championship and ended the season 15-0. Alright, so when we look at all the individuals on the Oklahoma team and their performances, the one that really sticks out is Jalen Hurts, who had 3,800 passing yards and just under 1,300 rushing yards. He ended up finishing 2nd that year in the Heisman voting behind Joe Burrow and had an all-around great year. Another great performance was CeeDee Lamb, who had 1,327 receiving yards and 14 touchdowns. On the other side of the ball, Kenneth Murray was the team's leading tackler for the 2nd year in a row with 102 total tackles. Okay, so when we look at all of the years that I just went over, we can see that there is one thing in common with all of them. And each year, Oklahoma had one loss during the regular season that may have hurt them more than it may seem. You may also notice that each year besides that 2017 season, they made the college football playoff and were the 4th seed. This could somewhat be credited to that one loss that they had in each year. Oklahoma proved that they were the best team in the Big 12 for many years. However, the problem is that they never really earned respect outside of the Big 12. Like most teams in that conference, they were usually always known for their great offense, but never really had a great defense. Because of that, most people knew that the offensive strategy they used against Big 12 teams would not work as well against teams outside of the Big 12. But with the stigma that comes with this conference, Oklahoma is not really in a position to prove themselves outside of this conference. Until now. With the Sooners moving into the SEC and being in a new conference with a different schedule in the 2024 season, they will have much better competition and will have a better chance than they have ever had to prove how good they actually are. If they can pull off what they've been doing for the last couple years besides this last season in the SEC, then analysts and coaches will have to admit that they are a legit championship contender, and therefore it will allow them to convincingly make the playoffs instead of barely sliding into that 4th spot and having to play the number 1 team every time they have a shot at a championship. As the 2024 season gets closer, both Texas and Oklahoma will have a chance that they have never had before, which is to prove that they are either one of the top teams in college football or they're just another average squad. Either way, I'm excited to see how this whole process plays out, and maybe we'll see a different Oklahoma team in the upcoming years. Alright guys, that's going to do it for this video. If y'all enjoyed it, don't forget to like and share, as that helps the channel to grow. Besides that, until next time.